excited to welcome the Caron YouTube audience on the 26th of June, special weekend for us, 2022, alumni weekend. We have a packed room here with alumni, family members, patients, and other Caron visitors, and folks even watching on the live stream around the campus, and sense of exuberance and excitement in the air. Start with a little irony. I've been working on this message all week. I've been wrestling with the topic of surrender. It only struck me how absurd that was late last night, but it's such a human thing. So those of you who are familiar with recovery, especially as it's presented in the 12-step frame, probably are familiar with the emphasis that occurs on the topic of surrender in that tradition. And it's a perennially difficult topic. Like, people really struggle with it. And it's part of my chapel topic rotation, and when it comes up, I struggle with it. So there must be something really quite to it. And I have the privilege occasionally of providing for group work, and maybe 6 weeks ago, I was doing a group with a patient population here on campus that I don't always get the privilege of working with. So I kind of felt like I walked into a buzzsaw. But it's tricky when you're a clinician and you work with people who know you as one of their regular providers. There's a rapport already, and this is, I have to remember to make the connection. That's part of what I think helps with surrender is trust. But anyway, I was walking into a unit that didn't really know me very well, and I was like, let's talk about surrender. And what happened in the group was that there was a faction of the group that expressed their struggle with surrender in a way that I often have learned to think about it, and they were the men. And there was a smaller group in the segment of the population that were female, and their take on the whole subject was quite different. And they were, they'd listened to those of us who were male weigh in about surrender and how it's difficult for us and this and that. And then there was this one particularly passionate and vocal of the women in the room who said, surrender, I always have to be careful with my language. It pisses me off. And I've been told to surrender all my life. And hearing men tell me to surrender is like I'm up to here with it. And it caused me to pull back for a minute. And I will say, one of the things I thought was really cool about the group was that by the time we reached the end of the group, there was a different way in which the word was being interpreted. And there was a sense in which everyone in the group was finding a point of entry into what I think is a deeper way of appreciating the concept that we use the word to point to. And I think there's a choice that the clinical practitioner and the recovering person and all of us can make with regards to language and outdated texts or whatever. And one is to say it's not for me, and the other is to figure out a way to appropriate language. Like, for example, God language. It's okay to say I'm not, every time you hear the word God, I get, and there's also people who have stayed in recovery paths who are like, when I hear the word God, I think good orderly direction or great outdoors, or, or I just turn it into an idea that is applicable to me, or the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, whatever. So that is a choice. And with regards to surrender in womanism, feminism, which obviously I'm a straight white male, so I don't know why I think I can talk about it, but anyway, what has happened over the last 20 or more years is that there are people who have supported a non-emphasis on surrender. And for example, some of you may know the work of Stephanie Covington, came out of Hazel Lynn Betty Ford. We call that the evil empire of the North, but her work is brilliant in terms of providing a path of navigation through the 12-step recovery for women and sort of tiptoeing around the very sensitive issues that can arise for women, because the tradition out of which the 12 steps emerged was truly very male-centric. And also 1935 to 39 is the founding year of the document. So there's a lot of embedded cultural patriarchy in there. So maybe we need to cut Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob a little bit of a break, but woke was not happening at that period of time. So Stephanie Covington, I was looking up about this whole thing, and there was a woman whose name I'll forget, but I can give some access to. I found a blog by a woman who was remarking about how for her surrender and recovery is one of those things where she's heard take what you like and leave the rest, and for her she has to bracket the surrender thing. Interestingly, in her blog too, she said, this is the thing about surrender I will keep, but there's pieces of surrender language I set aside. So I want to interpret for you, as I was trying to think about that, where this took me. I went down it's kind of a deep bunny trail, and I popped up at the end, and I also want to be judicious about the time. So for me as a young man, I first think I understood surrender in relation to combat, right? And I didn't come from, my dad served in the military, but we were not a military family in the sense that people are from military families. And yet I learned in history that I remember learning about the treaty signings of various endings of significant wars, and I thought of those as surrender. And when I came into my own addiction recovery, this led me to this perception of surrender as a singular event. When was I going to sign on the dotted line and give up? And I think there are moments of surrender for me that have happened in my recovery, and I could go back and tell you through all of them. But in my little down the bunny trail, I happened to go back to the work of Ram Dass. I don't know if any of you know who Ram Dass was. He died in 2019. Very, very interesting spiritual writer of the 20th and 21st centuries, and eclectic and somewhat tricky sometimes for those of us who are rigidly abstinent from all substances. But anyway, Ram Dass has a lot to say about spiritual thinking and brought a lot of his spiritual thought from Hinduism. And I'm going to lose the word. There's a word like saganatika or something like that, which is a word that he associates with surrender. And he says that you can't really translate the word because of this unfortunate problem in English of our association with surrender with combat, that this concept in Hinduism is more about surrender as a process. And that heads in a really good direction for me, because I think that, I'm flipping up my outline, but one of the things I've come to appreciate is that in working here among the clinical teams that I have the privilege to work with, I will share with you, and those of you who are current patients, we listen and attend to each of you, wondering whether we are discerning this process spirit. There is for me, I like to often call it a disposition, or you could call it an impression that I get. So if I'm listening to Marty or whatever, and or Christine, or someone, or Johnny, and I can ask myself, am I taking away the impression of an embrace of a surrendered disposition as a way of ongoing, it's a way of going about in life. And I think that there's something there that relates to the person who is trapped in addiction and the person who seeks to find freedom from active addiction. So that second stop in I frequently, one of the things I often do, and I did that this week, is I try to ask, as I have a topic, what would the different wisdom traditions with which I'm familiar speak into the topic? So I stopped in Hinduism and Ram Dass, then I stopped in Buddhism. And Buddhism has a very, very rich concept, especially Theravadan Buddhism, which is the kind of Cambodian, Southeast Asian, sort of more, I think, ancient, and some people think more pure form of Buddhism. Has a very clear understanding that the first of the 4 stages in the path towards enlightenment is this idea of stream entering, which I think is such a cool formulation of what surrender is. I used to teach a lot about a parable that I had heard, which is like a water bug trying to get to a rock and a leaf flowing down the stream. And which one makes better progress, right? The leaf flowing down the stream makes better progress. And the water bug trying to get to the rock is continuously frustrated and thrown back on the sideline. And so there is a moral to that story, which is stream entering allows greater movement and progress. And so in that sense, the Buddhist teaching for me is to enter into the flows of which I can be a part. And I think that that's the impression that I'm trying to get when I'm listening to Johnny or somebody else. I always use him as my straw person in the room. I hope that's okay with you. You can tell me not someday. But it's because I have immense respect for him and his recovery. So, and I think I can out him with the yellow shirt. I must be able to. So, in this stream entering thing, if you read in Buddhism a little more deeply, what the transition is from not being at that stage of enlightenment to being in that stage of enlightenment is the relinquishment of 3, I love this word, fetters. So you are fettered until you relinquish these fetters, and it's part of the underlying gestalt of Buddhism is non-attachment. So I'm going to go back to the group I did and the division between the masculine and the feminine appropriation of the concept, and share with you when I came to 2 ahas. And one of the ahas was maybe what fetters a man and what fetters a woman, I apologize for the gross stereotyping of this, but what frequently fetters men and what frequently fetters women, let's say, is different. And I came to think that's probably really true. For me, there's some resonance with that. But the thing that we might have in common is that the resolution of this fetteredness can be a part of what can help us move forward in sustaining abstinence and flourishing in recovery. And so on the masculine stereotypical side, what I think, this is what the woman in the corner of the room, who was so eloquent and passionate about her statement, was saying was that you men need ego deflation maybe because of your freaking narcissism and the control craft that you have inflicted on me and us for millennia. Okay, interesting point, right? And underlying that from a clinical perspective, what I hear is an experience that this woman has of masculinity as narcissistic, in the sense that it's lacking empathy, right? And to me, I in all of my years of being in recovery, this is what I've heard time and time again, is that I do think it's the predominant interpretation of surrender, is relinquishment of self-will. And there's an AA phrase about self-will run riot. And I don't know how many of you that speaks to, but to me it speaks deeply to me. And I do feel like my recovery has benefited to the degree I have been able to relinquish my brutal attachment to the self-will run riot. I remember years ago I learned a phrase, I never let go of anything that didn't have claw marks attached to it. And so to me, I'm going to put that in the stereotypically masculine frame. And I'm going to swing my attention over to amazing women who have had such an influence on my life. As Patience, the woman I'm married to, who is unbelievable and in her own right ferociously independent and powerful. What I think I have watched surrender mean for these persons is, or what is the fetter that has inhibited them from exhibiting a disposition of surrender, is trust and fear. So often it's trauma-driven, right? So in fact, if you think about the woman in the corner of the group who's like, you're telling me to surrender and I don't trust you. So the fetter there is fear. And the movement into the stream requires this reconciliation with wounding, which is, I think, a tricky, I think they're both very tricky. To get the person who is lost in the enamored illusion of their grandiosity and self-power and lacks empathy for others to somehow move into a humble and servant orientation is a very, very tricky move. But to get the person who is felt threatened and is inherently distrustful of voices of power seeking to impose structures on them and invite them to join in the stream, those are both, that's why this is a tough thing. It's not because, it is partly, I think, in either case, the movement towards enlightenment, if we think of this in a Buddhist way, is not easy. We're somewhat trapped in the state out of which we emerge out of adolescence and into our adult life. But I'll finish with the other aha. One of the things that has also helped me a great deal in the last few years is a turn in clinical care, in trauma work, and in a variety of fields. Not only to story, which is really helpful instead of like analytical proof and argument, but to the body. And one of the profound works of trauma therapy in the last several years was Bessel van der Kolk and his writing, The Body Keeps the Score. There may be people in the room who have either read his work or been influenced by him. And frequently, if you're a patient here and you are working with your therapist, and the therapist says to you, where are you feeling this in your body? You may want to go, like, I'm feeling it in my fingers, I want to poke them in your eyes. But there's really good reason for those questions, because our bodies can tell us things that words don't really necessarily express. When Marty was reflecting on Renee's music and talking about its heart, I think music has the capacity to take us to the nonverbal place. But I think the cues that we were also taking from Renee were nonverbal and somatic, which is an adjective about the body, right? So a thing I remember is we used to have a clinician here, and he used to be fond. Oh, tiny tidbit, by the way. The word surrender is not in AA's big book. You know? Shocking to me. It's not in the big book. It's in subsequent language, and you can find surrender like all over the recovery pages on the internet, but it wasn't a driving. The third step is a driving point for Bill Wilson in the 12-step movement, which I think is correlated with this. But anyway, we had a clinician here a number of years ago, and he was fond of a particular exercise in which largely, I don't know, I was trying to think if he worked mostly, at the time I knew him, he was working mostly with women, but then he was in another side of the street where he was working with male and female clients. And anyway, he had this thing where when he thought that a client was ready to surrender, he would have that client, he would open the big book to a page where the third step prayer is evident. And he would have them kneel at the chair, and he would have this person read this prayer. So, I'm going to kneel for a second. This was the posture of surrender that clinician interpreted. And I'm going to trip over my dress, and then I'm going to... The aha that I had was that I don't know that I envision surrender at all like that. I certainly don't envision entering the stream that way. The way I envision surrender is this way. It's joining hands with one another, right? It's becoming a part of a community. I was just telling the audience here we're not going to do the circle chant, but it's the old circle chant that it's like swaying together. It's love. It's movement out of either that narcissism and ego or out of fear. It's out of aloneness to community. And it's a willingness to allow ourselves to be a part of rather than apart from. And it's the damn loneliness of addiction that I think causes us to have memorial services with so many dead. And the invitation that I extend to you today is not an admission of defeat. It's an entrance into a different kind of life. My early days of my recovery, they used to say, surrender to win. And I was like, what? But now I understand that, right? To me, this is at the heart of what we're talking about, is that this invitation is an invitation out of aloneness and out of fear and out of egoism into shared mutuality and flourishing, resilience, and recovery. And I think it's a lot more palatable as that. To get down to brass tacks, I hate to ruin what I think has been a good message, but I'm going to take advantage of saying, where the treatment team also listens is when I'm not going wherever you're telling me to go, right? And next level of care recommendations. It's a red flag. It is a red flag. When you are, is that fear that drives that, or is that narcissism? And it's funny, underline that, they're actually the same wound. The narcissism wound and the trust trauma wound are still a wound. So it's really fear that inhibits us from doing this. And what it looks like when we enter the stream is more an acceptance of the wisdom that is put in front of us by those who have trodden this path before. So if you are reluctant to heed the counsel of the stream, I just also would want to say in a pastoral way, you are not alone. This is what happens to most of us, is that it's hard to accept the invitations. What do you mean sober living? I want to get back to my dog, and I think if you can hear that might be fear that is really what it is, that is binding, and a profound fetter that will inhibit spiritual progress and save lives and do all sorts of wonderful things. My prayer today is not that you would kneel in submission and feel like you are admitting some kind of tragic defeat, but that you would join the parade to victory.